Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 195. Just 5 away from 200. Countdown begins. And this week it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, I have one that was a very quick one to listen to, and I am hoping to summarize it and discuss it pretty quickly because it's by Jim Kwik. And you have to do everything quickly when you're talking about Jim Kwik. Actually, everyone who has listened to us for a while knows that we both love Jim Kwik. And one of the things he does very well is provide great content in a very quick format. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes us 45 minutes to unwind it. But this one, I think everyone will relate to in one way or another. And if you remember, my last one was about an author who had written about her decision to not drink alcohol. So just kind of following on that theme, but actually this isn't about alcohol at all. It is episode 370 of Kwik Brain, and it is called The Reason Behind Your Addiction. On this episode, his guest is Dr. Daniel Lieberman. He is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at George Washington University here in the U.S., and he's also co-author of the international bestseller, The Molecule of More, How a Single Chemical in Your Brain Drives Love, Sex, and Creativity and Will Determine the Fate of the Human Race.
Wow.
Any guesses? Any guesses of what chemical we're talking about, Daisy?
The molecule of more in the brain, it drives all those things. Dopamine?
Ding, 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 ding. Very good.
Yeah. I know it's one of your favorites.
Absolutely. And of course, I love listening to Andrew Huberman, but his episodes are 2 and 3 hours long and so complicated. So this is a nice short one about dopamine. Jim Kwik kind of opens with, why is it that the behavior that an addict does makes total sense to them, but when you're watching it, you're like, oh my gosh, that doesn't make any sense. Why are they doing that? Why did they lose their relationships in their home, in their car, in their job to have more of that substance? Dopamine really is what it makes us ask for more. It's why we discover things. It's why we prosper and progress. But it's also why we struggle with addiction. And so enters Dr. Daniel Lieberman. They start to discuss the idea that dopamine is a neurotransmitter, so one of those chemicals that provides information for the brain. And I say this often, I've said this to you in here, I say this in my work in the fasting method community. One of the errors that people often have about dopamine is they just think of it as pleasure, that I get pleasure from it, so I do it. I'm going to get my dopamine hit. I'm getting lots of dopamine hits. And that's really not the purpose of dopamine, although it does feel pleasurable. The way that dopamine is actually different than just being about pleasure is it actually serves as a driver for seeking things in the future. Some people may remember I've talked about this. I know Andrew Huberman has talked about this, where they have disconnected the dopamine response in a rat's brain, and the rat will lie one body length away from their bowl of food, and they won't move to get it. Now, if you give them the food, they eat it. So it's not that they're not getting pleasure from the food. It's that taking the step to get it has been disconnected for them because they have no drive to get that thing. They have no drive for their future. So it really highlights for our brain and causes us to react for what is new, what is possible, and what we don't have now. Now, serotonin helps us enjoy and be satisfied with what we have right now. So it's kind of amotivational, but dopamine is motivational. It makes us go get something, go, seek that. So again, dopamine is not actually about current pleasure. It's about what is possible. And what we really do is we get the biggest response to dopamine in anticipation of something. the excitement, the interest in what's coming is really the strongest dopamine hit. And he goes through an example of Winnie the Pooh and must be Eeyore or Tigger or Christopher Robin. I don't remember who the conversation's with, but the other asks him, what's your favorite thing in the world? And Pooh is just about to say eating honey, and he interrupts himself and says, it's that moment right before I eat the honey. So that's where our biggest dopamine response really lies. One of the things that Dr. Lieberman talked about that's often confusing for people and why dopamine can lead us astray is that the satisfaction that we get from accomplishing something is very different than the type of satisfaction we feel from dopamine. So again, it almost makes us bypass feeling satisfied with what we've achieved, what we're experiencing right now, and instead makes us want more. Now, I'm automatically thinking of Girl Scout cookies. It makes me think, oh, this one that I just had, not so satisfying. Let's get more. Oh, this whole sleeve of Thin Mints that I've eaten, not very satisfying. Let's get another sleeve. So you can see why that builds addiction. So dopamine really kind of plays on the question of what do I want? What else is available? What more can I get? So again, more, a higher payout, that's what we're seeking, rather than, again, that current satisfaction. So the other challenge with dopamine in response to this is really dopamine leaves us chronically dissatisfied and seeking more. So people think, I'm just going to go get this dopamine hit, but actually now you're going to want 5 hits, and then you're going to want 12 hits. It's going to just keep you wanting more. So really, again, unable to enjoy what we already have or have just accomplished, and instead dissatisfied with that and wanting more. So he goes into a little more explanation of this, Dr. Lieberman does, and he says, basically, we do things based on desire. And dopamine is the chemical of desire. Of all of the neurotransmitters, it is the one that creates desire. So then the two of them launch into a little bit of conversation about addiction. And of course, whenever addiction comes up, oftentimes they're discussing drugs or alcohol, but he does often use other behaviors as sources of addiction and, of course, food as a substance of addiction. The debate often is it a medical illness or is it a behavioral thing? Is it something we do have choice in? And he says actually he sees addiction as both. It is about choice and about a medical illness. It is driven by cravings, and we as people are driven by desire and cravings. Cravings reduce our free will. So as long as you're someone who even believes in free will, just know that our cravings make following free will more complicated. It doesn't make it impossible to make the right choice, but it certainly makes it much harder to say no to something. So let's use the someone wants to lose weight example. Really important to me to lose weight, but there's a cupcake sitting right here in front of me. So one is about, I have free will, I cannot eat this cupcake, and I want this bigger goal, but the craving makes it very complicated to do the prolonged, I'll do what's good for me in the future. The craving makes us want to do what's fun and pleasurable and enjoyable right now in the moment. He then talks about that, yes, it is partly a medical illness because the substance or the behavior rewires our brain. So it is about choice, and it becomes about a medical illness because we've changed our brain based on choice. So that's how he describes addiction. Now, if you take someone who is already addicted to a substance, they may not be able to resist the craving. So some people say, well, they don't have choice. So they can't resist it maybe when it's happening. But what he says that's really more important is it's about making a smart decision to get treatment or change our environment that's available. So too long, don't read, too long, don't listen. If you want to avoid eating problematic food, make sure they're not available. Get them out of your house, because dopamine and that response system is going to make it very hard to resist them, very hard to overcome that craving.
Yeah, it definitely makes it easier. It's like, when James Clear talks about putting as much friction in the way as possible. The more friction,
that's right,
the better.
So he then says, of course, overcoming addiction, it's not about being strong. Oftentimes people think, I'm not strong enough to do that. In my work, people say, Terri, I'm not strong enough to resist that. It's not about being strong. We're all strong enough. It's really about being smart and figuring out, what do I do to decrease the craving? How can I avoid the craving rather than have to muscle my way through the craving? The other interesting thing I think that he said about it is that dopamine signals value to something. So he uses this small example and he says, so if you get positive feedback from your boss for something you've done, that feels good. But if you're anticipating getting a large reward, being honored at the honors banquet and getting a monetary thing, that means so much more to you than that positive feedback from the boss. The anticipation of that bigger reward kind of overshadows the smaller. And so again, dopamine makes us seek the bigger reward, the bigger payout. So it really kind of artificially stimulates or teaches us to place higher value on a particular thing rather than other things. So for example, why, if I'm addicted to a particular drug, do I not care that I didn't show up at work that day? That becomes insignificant to me. Earning that money, completing my job becomes less important than seeking more of that substance. He uses this example at some point, and it just reminded me of a conversation you and I had in an episode way early on about getting up in the morning. And, if our goal is, I want to get up bright and early to do this task, but once the alarm goes off, if you jump out of bed, you've won. You avoided the debate, you avoided the craving. But if you lie there for a minute and think, it's so comfortable here and I'd really like more sleep, you've lost the battle. The craving, the free will battle is kind of lost because suddenly getting up and exercising doesn't feel very important. But staying right here and getting 15 more minutes of sleep, which is probably why me using the snooze button has always backfired on me. I'm like, I'll just get 15 minutes more. And an hour and a half later, I'm still pushing the snooze button. So again, to highlight for people, when they think about dopamine, anticipation is stronger than the actual satisfaction that it brings. So this to me is also about being smarter. Don't fall for it. Well, if I just eat one, I'll feel great, and then I'll go do what I need to do. Or if I just push snooze once, I'll feel great, and then I'll do it. Nope. The anticipation is stronger than getting the actual satisfaction. He then dives into another reason why we struggle so much, and I think this is really important for people to understand. He says, realistically, in our brain, we have different dopamine circuits. But the one that most of us think about is the desire circuit. And this is that we desire something and then we feel pleasure when we get it. So this is the dopamine piece that most of us are usually thinking about. But the other dopamine circuit is in our frontal cortex. And that's the part of our brain where we have reasoning abilities, we can do abstract reasoning, and we can control behavior. So in the frontal cortex, this is the control circuit of dopamine. It maximizes future resources. It plans and decides how you're going to get it. So that part of our brain does look into the future and controls our behavior. So you can imagine by these two circuits, you can understand why we get into such a dilemma. Like we're having an internal debate because we have the desire circuit that says, oh, but this cookie would taste so good right now. And our control circuit is saying, oh, but if I eat this right now, I'm going to have cravings later. I'm not going to feel well. I'm going to have achy joints, and I'm not going to lose weight. So which is going to win, the desire circuit or the control circuit? And what do you think?
Well, usually the former.
Absolutely. So oftentimes in my work, people come to me and say, Terri, I just don't understand it. Why do I keep giving in to those tempting foods? I know they're not going to help me get there.
Mm.
It's that internal battle between the desire circuit and the control circuit. And because the desire circuit is likely going to win, what we need to do then, okay, what do we do about all this dopamine dilemma? We have to help insert some controls. Like, let's say the issue for me is I get my dopamine hits from checking social media 4,027 times a day. I can't just convince my brain to stop wanting to do that. I'm not going to get rid of the desire circuit, but instead I want to insert more controls. So setting up a thing like I only get to go in and check them at the 45-minute mark, and then I have to be done at the top of the hour.
Mm.
So implanting controls. I remember sharing this. I don't remember if it was in a podcast episode or in a webinar that I did for the fasting method, but James Clear talks about this, and he talks about some people actually have to have other people help them with the controls. And he talked about someone who was an executive in a company, but he would get wrapped up in social media or playing games on his phone or whatever. He had to have his assistant lock it during the day and not give him the passcode until Friday. So he could go home and play it all weekend long if he wanted. But in order to get his work done, he needed someone else to place the control on him. So again, when people are wondering, well, what should I do? I mean, this desire is so strong. Get help. If you can't put the controls in yourself, get help with it. Jim Kwik asks real quickly here, he says, wait a minute, what about all these dopamine detoxes I see everyone talking about? Is this helpful?
I've not heard of that.
Dopamine detox means like I'm not going to do any of these dopamine things. And the way I see it most often is people sign off of social media.
Right.
I'm going through a dopamine detox. I'm not going to get these hits. And I think this is also useful for people just thinking about changing their eating behaviors, changing their drinking behaviors, gambling, whatever it is. A dopamine detox, he said, is not usually very helpful because most of them do them for a very short time. And in actuality, the brain changes very slowly. So one, you probably aren't going to change it. If you do a social media detox over the weekend and think it's going to help you do it better, it's unlikely. And he brings up the, researched fact for many changes of behavior, it takes like 10,000 hours.
Wow.
So a 2-day dopamine detox is not really going to change the brain. And unfortunately, our brain switches back very quickly when we re-engage that behavior. So if I say I'm going to stop eating cookies for the weekend, right back on full force and maybe even more.
I mean, of course it will, if you think about it. If it's something you've been doing for years, decades, whatever, even if you do a lengthy process of changing it and are quite successful with it, you switch back to that old rut and your brain falls into it really easily.
Absolutely. And this leads to the next thing that kind of just fits right here is that dopamine really induces tolerance. So let's say in the beginning, if you're using a particular substance, a drug or a food or a behavior, in the beginning, one cookie gives you the response you want. But very quickly, your brain adapts to that. That's no longer new. That's no longer satisfying the desire. And, in a few months, you need 20 cookies and you still don't even get as big of a response. And so again, I think of when people say to me, Terri, I used to be able to fast and I did great. And now I'm trying to start it again. How come I'm having trouble? It's not new anymore. It's not a novel thing for the brain. Our brain, that desire, that seeking more, increases the threshold. So unfortunately, they don't give all the solutions in this brief podcast, but obviously really talking about the best thing you can do is work on strategies to minimize the cravings rather than try and just overpower them and make your brain stronger. Again, it's not about being strong, it's about being smarter, avoiding the cravings. The last tip that Dr. Lieberman gave is that when you are going to basically say no to the craving or say no to the desire for more, he said you have to work on having things that you say yes to. Because if you just say no, 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 and you don't have something else, your brain is going to keep going for that. So if you're going to work on avoiding drinking, what are you going to do instead? Oh, I'm going to call a friend. I'm going to go for a walk. So you have to have things that you're saying yes to give some satisfaction. Otherwise, your brain will really struggle to follow your no response and eliminate that behavior.
This is a story I know that I've shared probably on this podcast, definitely on Keto Women, and definitely when we've spoken together on one or either. It's the story of the ice cream binge. And I can remember as soon as at the beginning when you were saying it's more about the anticipation than it is the actual satisfaction with the having is way, way down on that ladder. And I can remember it becoming very, very clear to me when they started selling my favourite ice cream in France, Haagen-Dazs, just to put it out there. We don't get sponsored by Haagen-Dazs. But they started stocking it. It was my favourite thing. And I'd planned this trip to the supermarket to go and get it. And it was on a Sunday and it closed. So there was this sort of urgency to it because I had to get there before midday. Those were the days when I struggled to get up before midday. So it was, it was this kind of special thing. Thinking about it, the anticipation built. And when I was thinking about it afterwards, I thought, I can think about it, this building up, this climbing up this ladder of anticipation. By the time I was putting those first mouthfuls of the multiple tubs I bought, because of course there had to be multiple tubs, so there were different flavors that helped with the, that was all part of the anticipation, the different flavors, yada, yada. I was coming down the other side. By the time I took that first mouthful, I couldn't stop because of that, needing more and more and more, and sitting there eating my way through loads of ice cream with tears streaming down my face because of all those warring factions that were going on in my brain, and that really brought it home to me. And also that link, I think, with the serotonin you were saying is involved with the being satisfied with what you have. And it made me think how much there is this, is it partly anyway, a dopamine serotonin imbalance when it comes to depression? I'm thinking of the links with depression. It definitely was in a deep, dark place of depression at that time. So all these sort of things swimming around my head. But like you were saying, people do, I think in general, think about dopamine in slightly the wrong way. And I think you've just highlighted that in today's episode. And you did mention, and I will mention, I'm afraid you do have to be a member of the Fasting Method community to access this. But I enjoyed very much, you referred to them, a couple of webinars. I think it was a 2-part webinar series you did about dopamine. And I do think that's where you told that story. I was reminded of it. But I would encourage anyone who is a member of the TFM community, go and find that in the webinars, because Terri talks about dopamine for 2 webinars and it was really, really interesting. So I recommend you go and do that. But yes, always happy to hear you talking about dopamine, especially coming from Jim Kwik, of course. So very, very interesting.
Very good. And one of the last things I'll highlight based on what you just said, Daisy, is the reason I keep talking about dopamine. One is to try and clear up for people kind of some misunderstandings of it, but also to help put into perspective why we struggle with it. It's not because we're weak. It's not because we, just don't have the moral character to avoid cookies or to stop using something that's harming us, or that we're dumb, that we are willing to give up things that we really value for this thing. It's dopamine. But please don't just feel, victim to dopamine either. We can help manage it by setting up better strategies. So I don't want anyone just feeling, well, it's not my fault, it's dopamine. We can be smart enough to use our dopamine more effectively rather than letting it run us.
Yes, and that whole thing about you saying, you're not weak if you can't summon the motivation that you think you need. As you say so many times, we can do hard things. And I think every one of us can think of an example where we have overcome something, we have battled against something that was really, really hard. And just before we go, that was a note I made, that it's not that we're not strong enough, because we are strong enough to do really hard things. Mm-hmm. But I think there is quite often we wonder why we're so weak, because we probably can think of these examples where we've overcome something that's really hard, that's an acute thing.
That's right.
So something that happens a one-off, and we can amaze ourselves with what we can cope with. So why can't we cope with the chronic thing, the smaller thing, seemingly, that is every day, but actually that one is often a lot harder to deal with? So just be a bit kind to yourself and come up with some things, come up with some controls, like you said. And if they're not things that you can do yourself, find someone else to help.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, until we meet again, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone.